Hello, everybody. This is Dan Bustillos with LumosConsulting. Today, we're going to talk about microsegmentation within ACI. A lot of the conversations that I'm involved with recently around security involve microsegmentation, and the question is, how does ACI provide that for me? So today, we're going to cover the basis on that. We're going to talk about the differences that ACI provides as far as intra EPG isolation and attribute-based isolation. So we're going to take a look at that. A couple of things we're going to do today is we're going to go through a slide deck covering all the microsegmentation components. Once we get through that, then we're going to go into a live demo that I've got set up that's going to showcase the two types. So we're going to be looking at a couple of VMs with inside an EPG. We're going to look at how we can microseg them, so those VMs inside that EPG can no longer communicate, also known as intra EPG isolation. And then we're going to also take a look at how I can dynamically shift endpoints into different EPGs, more specifically into the USEG EPGs, and this is done with attributes. So we're going to be looking at that in a live demo as well. So here's the agenda for today. We're going to talk about micro EPGs, their features, functionalities, differences between them and the base EPGs. We're also going to look at attribute-based isolation. This is the dynamic shifting of endpoints into these USEG EPGs. From there, we're going to talk about intra EPG isolation. We're going to go into intra EPG contracts, and then we're going to discuss microsegmentation with VMware and VDS specifically, especially if UCS is in the mix. So we're going to go through that. And then lastly, like I said, we're going to talk about the demo. We're going to go through that and look at the actual command line, ACI GUI, etc., on how we can actually apply microsegmentation. So let's talk first about micro EPGs, also known as USEG EPGs. In ACI, we have two types of EPGs. We have our base EPGs, and we also have these micro EPGs. So when you're in the GUI, most of us are familiar with base EPGs. We've probably also seen the micro EPGs as well. Now, they're very similar to base EPGs. However, there's a couple differences that we'll discuss. One of those differences is that we classify these USEG EPGs more so on endpoint attributes versus VLAN encapsulation. So that's one of the differences there. Also, one of the differences that we look at is an endpoint within these EPGs must be learned by a base EPG prior to being shifted into this USEG EPG. So an example is I have a web VM, it's in a base EPG, and I want to dynamically move it into this USEG. I can do that because it's learned by that base EPG first, and then I can build attributes within that EPG that will go out and grab that and dynamically shift it into this EPG. And we'll look at that more as we dive into the GUI. It'll probably make a little bit more sense on how we can build these attributes and then dynamically move things. So one thing I really want to bring up to everyone's attention is these USEG EPGs will not show up in vCenter as a port group. Okay, so I'm sure most of you are familiar with base EPGs. We build an EPG, we tie it to domain. Let's say it's a VMM domain. We push that down to vCenter. vCenter creates a port group for us for that EPG. We're not going to see that with these USEG EPGs. But what we will see is the hosts learned about from ACI. So for example, if I go into my USEG EPG, shift over to my operational tab, if I have hosts that are in there that I moved in, you will still see those in the operational tab. So that's where you go find them. You just will not see these port groups show up in vCenter. So I just want to make sure we're aware of that, so we're not scratching our heads down the road trying to figure out why these are not showing up in vCenter. We do support micro EPGs for virtual and physical. We can do mixed bag. Now, one thing to keep in mind as well is, and we'll talk about this a little bit further down the road, but these USEG EPGs also can do intra EPG isolation. So again, the biggest differences is that we're kind of using these guys more for attribute-based isolation, meaning I'm going to go in, I'm going to set some attributes for this EPG, I'm going to tie it to a domain, physical, virtual, and whatever host that I've decided to match on, it's going to go out, grab those, move them into this USEG EPG. So that's really the use case for these guys. I would say there's a couple use cases. One, it would be more of a security focus, right? So for example, let's say I had a security breach of Windows hosts. I can build a microseg EPG and I can set an attribute saying I want you to match on host, and I want that host operating system, and I want that operating system to be Windows. So what it's going to do is it's going to go out into your environment that the EPG is bound to. It's going to look for those specific attributes that we've declared, and then it's going to move those hosts inside of this EPG. So that's kind of critical. Let's say if we had an outreach, let's say some type of Windows hosts were compromised, and we wanted to quickly sandbox them. I could spin up this USEG EPG. I could dynamically shift them inside of it, and then I can apply no contracts so that it's fully isolated and there's no communication to that EPG. So I've effectively removed them from the other important groups they were in, and now they're isolated to this microseg EPG. And it's all done dynamically. So pretty powerful, right? Another use case could be, let's say I'm working, hand in hand with my server team, my VMware team, and they are tagging VMs as they spin them up. And I, on the ACI side, am looking for these tags to dynamically push them into these different EPGs. So, in that scenario, I could go into my microseg EPGs. I can set tags for VM name, just different operating systems. Maybe my data center, I want to match on data center. So we'll go through the different attribute types, but those would be some examples I would use microseg EPGs for. And we'll look at that a little bit more in the demo as well. So as I mentioned, there's different attribute type of classifications, right? So this is a quick list of what we can use to build our microseg EPG attribute list. So as you can see here, I can match on MAC address, I can match on IP address, I can match on VM name, VMM domain, data center, operating systems. There's a fairly good sized list. Now this list will grow exponentially more when you're doing VMM domain, right? So if I have a VMM domain, I can now match on the VM names, identifiers, things like that. If I'm doing more physical, bare metal, I'm kind of restricted more to a IP and MAC type of filtration. However, it's still some type of attribute base you can apply. Okay, so a lot of functionality here. You can really get granular with the type of attributes you want to apply to these guys. Okay, so just as we discussed, we can look at this a couple different ways, right? We can do the dynamic quarantine, which we talked about. So moving certain VMs based on their operating system, just as an example. So as we show here in our picture, we've got two EPGs, we've got an app EPG and a database EPG, and there's a Windows host in each. And I've declared that, hey, I'm building this USEG EPG called quarantine, and I wanted to go out and find all my Windows hosts, and I want to move them into this EPG. And again, I can apply whatever policies I need to for this USEG EPG for whatever my use case is, but dynamically I want to shift these inside of it. There is support for these attribute-based isolations for VDS and VMware. They're also supported in Hyper-V, KVM, AVS, and physical. So you do have a lot of options here whenever we're dealing with attribute-based isolation. Again, just to reiterate, attribute-based isolation is where I can dynamically set endpoints to move into these USEG EPGs based on attributes that I declared within my attribute rules. Okay, so that's the key for these type of isolation approaches. Now, one of the things I mentioned earlier is these dynamic moves, if you will only happen when I bind that EPG to a domain. Okay, so I could have this, for example, I can have this EPG, sitting idle. It's configured with attributes. It's ready to rock. But if I don't apply it to domain, it's not going to do anything. And this is with any EPG. Okay, so nothing different here. So let's say I built the EPG. I've got the attributes set. The minute I apply to that domain, that's when it's going to take effect. You can also do it the reverse way. You can build the EPG. You can bind it to the domain you're associating it to, and you can leave off the attribute. Now, when you're ready to actually trigger that, you can go in, set the attribute, submit it, and that's when the actual dynamic push will occur. So just a couple different ways you can do that, and it's all based on your needs and how you want to structure it. So intra EPG isolation, something we mentioned in the beginning. to me, this is more of the meat cleaver approach versus a scalpel approach. And what I mean by that is when you're dealing with intra EPG isolation, what we are effectively doing is we are turning that EPG into private VLAN mode. So any endpoints within that EPG will have no communication to each other, right? So that's great if that's what you want. However, if there's any use cases for certain endpoints within that EPG to communicate, you would need to apply some type of intra EPG contract, because effectively we're going to be shutting down all communication within those endpoints. As I mentioned earlier, we can microseg on virtual and physical within the same EPG. So if I had a web EPG and let's say I had some physical servers, some web servers, but they're all in the same EPG, it's still going to apply policy to all of them. It doesn't matter if they're physical or virtual. So one of the other things we need to talk about is this enforced and unenforced. I mentioned this earlier. Base EPGs can also be participating in microsegmentation, just like the USEG. Okay, we can make a base EPG intra isolated, and we can make a USEG EPG intra EPG isolated. There's really no difference there. Again, the biggest difference on the USEG EPGs, I'll just reiterate, is that I can do attribute based isolation. Okay, so as I mentioned earlier, we can now apply intra EPG contracts as of 3.0. And this is great because, as I mentioned earlier, if we have a scenario where I want microsegmentation within an EPG, this is a requirement, but there's a couple servers in there that still need communication, and I need them to communicate, whatever reason that may be. I can now go in and I can apply an intra EPG contract that allows that communication to happen. So nice thing about it, I can get very granular with these rule sets. I can go in and say, server 1, server 2 can communicate, but not server 3, server 4, etc. I can go in now and really tailor those rules, and then I can blanket my microsegmentation around that. So again, very, very critical and very powerful for specific use cases. All right, so lastly, we'll talk about microsegmentation and VMware and how this looks from a vCenter perspective. So what we're looking at here is a quick scenario where I've got one tenant, I've got an application profile, I've got 2 bridge domains, and I've got 2 endpoint groups. And each endpoint group is tied to a bridge domain, very net-centric approach. Each EPG is bound to a VMM domain. And what you're seeing there on the right, where it says PVLAN 8 and 9 and PVLAN 10 and 11, this is how vCenter is doing our microsegmentation. Okay, so basically what we're doing is when we say, hey, EPGA, you're going to be a microsegmentation candidate, vCenter is going to go ahead and place this port group in private VLAN mode. And some of the requirements for that is it's going to require 2 VLANs, a primary VLAN and an isolated VLAN. So very standard private VLAN configuration. So what it's going to do is it's going to grab 2 VLANs from ACI. You could do this dynamically or statically. So if we're doing dynamic and we have an association to a VMM domain, just be sure that you've got enough VLANs in there that will cover your primary and your isolated VLANs. So here's one thing we need to keep in mind. The private VLAN pairs are associated at the bridge domain level. So what does that mean? That means that if I have 10 bridge domains and 10 EPGs and an EPG tied to each bridge domain, and I want to microseg every EPG, I'm going to need a pair of VLANs for every bridge domain. And that's what you can see here. So you can see we're using private VLAN pair 8 and 9 for EPG web tied to bridge domain A. And then because I have bridge domain B tied to EPG app, I need another private pair, which I'm using 10 and 11. All right, so I can build that into my dynamic pool, right? And I can have those VLANs just go ahead and swing into vCenter. It'll give it the private VLAN pair. It'll set that port group to private VLAN, and I'm good to go. Or if I really want to get granular, I can set it statically, and I can say, hey, VLANs, 8 and 9 are going to be my private and isolated pair for this bridge domain. And you can set that in your pools and ACI as statics. And then we'll look at the GUI here in a little bit, but I'll show you where we can go and actually apply that. So this configuration will be done whenever you associate that EPG to the domain. It's got a selection there where you can say microseg, I want to do static, and then it'll ask you to put in your VLANs. One thing to keep in mind, if we are using any type of UCS down to these hosts, we want to make sure UCS has these VLANs as well. That way it can push those all the way down to your host. So just something to keep in mind there. There might be an initial step you got to take if you're using a UCS. So just keep that in mind. Okay, so as mentioned earlier, we're going to go into a live demo. This is a quick and dirty topology that we're going to be using. So what we have here is a tenant. I've got a EPG called web. I have two VMs in there, web VM01, web VM02. And I'm going to simulate that I can ping these two servers within the endpoint group. And then we're going to go ahead and do intra EPG isolation within that endpoint group and showcase how that communication no longer exists after that. Okay, and then our next thing we're going to do is we're going to send traffic from EPG web to app EPG. So we're going to go ahead and ping between the EPGs, and we're going to be doing that via contract. Okay, so that's how that communication is going to work. The scenario here, though, is going to be now looking at attribute-based isolation. So I'm going to go ahead and build an attribute rule that says I want to match on VM, web VM01. That's going to be the guy we want to move. And we're going to move him into the USEG EPG, right? So by moving him into that USEG EPG, we're going to effectively break his communication to the app EPG because there's no contract between USEG EPG and app EPG. So we're going to go ahead and showcase that. So let's get started. All right, so we've got our tenant here. We're in our GUI, we've got our tenant, and let's just get quickly familiar with things. I've got my app EPG built out here. You can see I've got my app VM01 at 10.10.1.14. I've got my web EPG, and I've got two VMs in here. Web VM01 and web VM02, 10.10.1, 10, and 10.10.1.12. So pretty straightforward, just like we talked about in the topology. So let's go ahead and simulate communication between these two endpoints within this endpoint group. Make sure we're good there. I'll get logged in here. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and ping over to web VM02. Oh my goodness. Okay. You can see we've got ping reachability to the O2 side. And if we log into web VM02, we can ping back. We're going to ping 10.10.1.10. So we've got intra EPG communication. All right. So now the scenario is I want to microseg these guys. I want to isolate this EPG so these two VMs can no longer communicate. Okay. So we're going to go ahead and check a couple of things that we talked about. We want to make sure we bound this to the domain correctly. So if we look at our domain association, we see that we've deployed this as immediate resolution is set to immediate and deploy is set to immediate. One of the key features we need to make sure whenever we're deploying for microseg, I've got my microseg checkbox ticked, and right now I'm doing dynamic. So I'm basically telling ACI use whatever VLANs that you can grab, two VLANs, send them down to vCenter. If you wanted to do static, you would simply select static, and then here's where you'd put in your primary and your secondary if you wanted to get more granular that way. So it looks like we're good there. Okay, so now we'll go back into our EPG here. We'll go under general, and we'll go under enforced. We'll go ahead and select that guy to enforced. And now when I submit him, we should break communication. So we're going to run that ping again and let this guy run for a second. I'm going to go back into my APIC. I'm going to submit this. And now I should see that I don't have any more connectivity to the second VM. And you can see my pings have stopped incrementing. If I up arrow, try again, I've lost communication to that VM. Now this is endpoint to endpoint within an endpoint group. So I've effectively microsegged these this EPG. So if I would take a step further, I can go into my vCenter and I can double check my port group. So if you go into your vCenter, check your port group, you can see that we've got a pair of VLANs, 1486 and 1487. This is just a dynamic pair that ACI had pushed down to us, but now this port group is in private VLAN mode. So kind of a good way of checking this too. If you're, if it's not working, come in here, making sure this guy is set to private VLAN. Okay. All right. So that's Intra EPG. So let's go ahead and bring this guy back, and I should have communication again. There we go. Okay. So now the other test was I should be able to ping my app server at 10.10.1.14. And I have a contract allowing web EPG to talk to app EPG, and that's how this communication is happening. Right, so the attribute-based isolation we discussed, right? We were talking about migrating web VM01 into my USEG EPG, which I have built down here. So the idea is move him into this USEG EPG based on an attribute that I declare. And by doing so, we're going to effectively break his communication to the app server because there's no contract in place, okay? So let's do that and watch what happens. So let's go into my USEG EPG. I'm going to go under USEG attributes. And I'm going to build an attribute based on name that we discussed earlier. So I'm going to go ahead and based on VM name. I'm going to set my operator to equals. I'm going to say web-vm-01 is my name. And I'm going to go ahead and submit them. Now, one thing to note, and I'll submit them first, but I've already got the domain binding here. So this is already set up. I don't need to go in and do this. It's already been done for me, so I'm good there, okay? Domain binding is complete. All I've done is I've set my attribute, right? So I've said you match on web-vm-01. Now, if I go into my USEG under my operational tab, I should see that VM in there. And there we go. There he is. And then to test this out even further, I can go back to my web VM, try to ping my app server again, and you can see the communication is broken. And this is broken because I have no contract between my USEG EPG and my app EPG. So if you go under contracts, you can see I have no contract. So that is effectively, I've sandboxed the server, moved him into the USEG EPG, and he can no longer talk to anybody. All right. So one of the ways we can revert this is we can remove the attribute, or you can remove the domain association. In our scenario, we'll go ahead and remove the attribute. So we'll keep this ping running, and we'll go ahead and remove this guy, delete him, and submit. And now he should swing right back into his normal EPG that he was in. It might take a second, but ping should start communicating, and there we go. And now he's back inside his EPG. If I go back under web, operational, I'll see that he's back, and I've got pings back to the app EPG. So yeah, so that's effectively how we can do intra EPG isolation, where we're taking our web servers and we're locking down the communication that live inside of that EPG. And then we've looked at USEG EPGs and how we can apply different attributes. Again, we can set different types here. As I mentioned earlier, I can search. I could have typed the IP address. I could have typed the operating system. There's different varieties that you can set here, and you can set different operators as well to match these. And then I can effectively move endpoints down into my USEG environment. So one of the last things we'll cover was Intra EPG contracts that we talked about. So if you go into contracts here and I right click, you can see that now I've got an opportunity to add an Intra EPG contract. So here's where we would go and apply that Intra EPG contract, like I mentioned before, if we want to allow communication to an endpoint group that's been microsegged. So just something to keep in mind, that's where you would go. You'd go under contracts. And again, this is valid for endpoint groups that are, base endpoint groups, as well as USEG EPGs. So I can go into contracts and grab my Intra EPG contracts as I needed to. So that's going to go ahead and conclude our microseg conversation for today. I hope that I hope this has been informative for you guys. Just to recap, base EPGs can still be microsegged. We just need to make sure they're bound in the domain. I've got a pair of VLANs down to my vCenter environment. If I'm using VMM domain, I can do intra EPG isolation on them. And then I can also do intra EPG isolation on my microseg EPGs. The microseg EPGs are used more for attribute-based isolation. So just like we showed earlier, we can set different variables to match on and dynamically move hosts in. Those are the big differences here. Again, we have the opportunity to provide Intra EPG contracts. So if we microseg and we want some communication there, we have that functionality. So I just really wanted to go over that and also making sure that we saw the GUI, we saw some of the functionality here. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to us at lumoscloud.com. We've got a lot of content on YouTube. You can follow me on Twitter at danbusti, DANBUSTI, and we look forward to seeing you down the road. Take care.